Plymouth introduced the Fury in 1956 as a special sporty edition of the Belvedere. The implications of a name suggesting anger and violence are unknown to me, perhaps for the Greek deities of vengeance, but it certainly worked out for Stephen King. Like other Plymouths of the time, it used a 115-inch wheelbase and was 205 inches long and weighed about 3,800 pounds. Prices started at a hefty for a Plymouth $2,900, but fewer than 5,000 were made. The engine was a 5-liter, 303 cubic inch V8 rated at 240 gross horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque. You had your choice of 3 or 4-speed manual or 2-speed automatic. It could do 60 in 8.5 seconds and the quarter mile in the high 16s. One would set a flying mile record of 124 miles an hour. Originally, it only came as a sandstone and gold hardtop coupe with distinct interior trim from lesser Plymouths. For 1957, styling was updated to the new forward look, and if you believe the advertising, suddenly it was 1960 with new torsion-air torsion bar front suspension. It looked much bigger, although it was only an inch longer on a 3-inch longer wheelbase, but it was nearly 5 inches wider and 7 inches lower, making it look longer. Weight was actually down about 100 pounds, and sales were still under 7,500. The polyhead wide block V8 was increased to 5.2 liters, or 318 cubic inches, with dual 4-barrel carburetors, and horsepower was up to 290 and torque to 325, with your choice of 3-speed manual or automatic. 60 now came in 8 seconds, and the quarter mile in the low 16, and the top speed was over 125. Updates for 1958 included additional colors and an optional Golden Commando 5.7-liter 350 cubic inch big block wedge head V8. With the dual 4 barrels, it had 305 horsepower and 370 pound-feet of torque. And with the optional Bendix fuel injection, it had an additional 10 horsepower. But the fuel injection system was recalled and replaced by the dual quads, which was only a tenth or two quicker than the 318 powered cars, all of which combined accounted for 5,300 cars. For 1959, the Fury became its own model as Plymouth's top trim level above the Belvedere and Savoy. It was now available as a 4-door, both post and hardtop, increasing total sales to 64,000. The trim level was offered as a wagon, but was called the Sport Suburban instead of Fury. Base engine was now a standard 2-barrel version of the 318 with 230 horsepower and 340 pound-feet of torque, or you could get the optional Super Pack 4-barrel version with 260 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque, while the Golden Commando V8 was up to 5.9 liters, or 361 cubic inches, with a single 4-barrel and dual exhaust for 305 horsepower and 395 pound-feet of torque. Transmissions included 3 and 4-speed manuals and 2 and 3-speed automatics, although the Golden Commando only came with the 3-speed automatic. There was also a new Sport Fury with special trim inside and out that only came in hardtop coupe and convertible, and the Super Pack 318 came standard. A Fury started at $2,700 and a Sport Fury at $2,900. And then it was actually 1960. And the Fury transitioned to unibody construction. Base engine was the new slant 6, a straight 6 tilted 30 degrees to allow for a lower hood. For the Fury, it was a 3.7-liter, 225 cubic inch variant with 145 horsepower and 215 pound-feet of torque. Prices were down to $2,600 and sales just under 60,000. The 318 and 361 carried over, although only as 2 barrels, in 230 and 260 horsepower. But now there was also a Sonoramic Commando 6.3-liter 383 wedge. It produced 330 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque, moving the big car to 60 in 6.5 seconds and the quarter mile in just over 15. The Sport Fury was gone, but the convertible and Sport Suburban remained. Styling updates for 1961 completely removed the fins, with interesting results. New B-body Plymouths arrived for 1962, with the Fury still sharing its body with the Belvedere and Savoy. Wheelbase was down to 116 inches, length to 202, and weight to 3,300 pounds. considered small for the class at the time. Engines carried over, but the Sport Suburban was now the Fury Suburban, and overall sales were back down under 40,000. The Sport Fury returned with a standard 318, with options going all the way up to the Max Wedge 413, or 6.8 liter. With dual 4 barrels, it produced 410 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque, and with the cross-ram manifold, both horsepower and torque went up by 10, leading to a 0 to 60 of just over 5 seconds and a quarter mile in the mid-13s. For 1963, the 361 gained 5 horsepower, and the Max Wedge was up to 7 liters and 426 cubic inches, 425 horsepower, and 480 pound-feet of torque, and the body was lengthened by 3 inches. Weight was up almost 200 pounds, so performance was actually down slightly. For 1965, the Fury name was moved to the all-new bigger C body, although the Belvedere and Satellite carried on the B body. Wheelbase was up to 119, length to 209, and weight to 3,600 pounds. Trim levels were 1, 2, 3, and Sport Fury, but as the sole full-size model name, sales now counted at over 310,000. The 361 was no longer available, but now you could get a 2-barrel 383 with 270 horsepower and 390 pound-feet of torque. And the 426 was down to a single 4-barrel with 365 horsepower and 470 pound-feet of torque, which would be replaced by a 7.2-liter 440 wedge with 10 more pound-feet of torque for 1966. And a new luxury version called the VIP was added. A semi-fastback fast top coupe was added for 1967, and for 1968 the Fury got a new small block LA 318 to replace the old polyhead A block 318. Torque was down by 5, but it was also about 75 pounds lighter. Bigger fuselage styling arrived for 1969. Wheelbase was up to 120, length to 215, and weight to 4,000 pounds. Prices were up slightly to $2,700, and sales were down slightly to just under 300,000. Horsepower from the 440 was up by 10, 60 was still under 7 seconds, and the quarter mile under 15, and it could do over 135 miles an hour. The Sport Fury was available as a 4-door for 1970 and now had hidden headlights. The 440 got optional dual exhaust, raising horsepower to 350. There was also a new GT Performance package with optional 6-pack or 3 2-barrel carburetors. This version had 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, making the car slightly quicker. The VIP was replaced by a Grand Coupe and Grand Sedan and the even better equipped Brougham, with such options as a split bench seat and an AM/FM cassette stereo with a microphone for recording. 1971 added a small block 5.9-liter 360 cubic inch V8 with 255 gross horsepower and 360 pound-feet of torque, while 1972 models lost the Slant 6, the Sport Fury, and the GT, but the Grand Coupe and Sedan kept the hidden headlights. The 383 was replaced by a 400 or 6.6 liter, and horsepower ratings transitioned to net, with the 318 being rated at 150 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque, the 360 at 175 horsepower and 285 pound-feet of torque, the 400 at 190 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque, and the 440 at 230 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque. 1973 was revised for the 5-mile-an-hour bumpers, and the hidden headlights went away. The cars once again got new styling for 1974, now with a more formal look. Then would be renamed Grand Fury for 1975, meaning the Grand package was no longer offered, but the Brougham carried on with its distinctive, although not really sporty look, while the freshly restyled midsize B-body cars would be renamed Fury, replacing the Satellite name. 2-door versions were on a 115-inch wheelbase, and 4 doors on 118. Overall length was 214 inches, and weight 3,700 pounds. Packages were base, custom, salon, and sport. Base engine was a 95 horsepower 225 Slant 6. The 318 was available in both 2 and 4 barrel versions. with 135 horsepower and 255 pound-feet of torque, and 150 horsepower and 255 pound-feet of torque. Same with the 360, with 180 horsepower and 290 pound-feet of torque, and 190 horsepower and 270 pound-feet of torque, as well as a high-output 230 horsepower, 300 pound-feet of torque version. And the 400 was offered in 165 horsepower, 295 pound-feet of torque, 185 horsepower, 285 pound-feet of torque, 190 horsepower, 290 pound-feet of torque, and 235 horsepower, 320 pound-feet of torque versions. For 1975 only, the Roadrunner was basically a Fury Sport with sportier suspension and tires and a graphics package. Either, with the high-performance 400, did 60 in under 9 seconds and the quarter mile in the mid-16s. The mid-size Fury started at $3,500, while the full-sized Grand Fury started at $4,600. With the smaller car selling just over $110,000 for 1975, while the bigger car only sold $70,000. A Fury police package with the 440 was also made, but it was not sold to the public. All 1976 Grand Furies had the Brougham look, and for 1977, the smaller Fury models got over-under rectangular headlights. Then the Grand Fury was discontinued for 1978. The Fury name would skip 1979 and return with new styling for 1980 as the new Grand Fury. Wheelbase was 119 inches, length 220, and weight 3,600 pounds. Prices were up to $6,800, but sales were down to $18,000. Engines included the 90 horsepower, 160 pound-feet of torque, 3.7 liter slant 6, and the V8 5.2 liter 318 two-barrel with 120 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque, or 155 horsepower, 240 pound-foot of torque 4-barrel, or 130 horsepower, 255 pound-feet of torque 2-barrel 360. By this point, the focus was fleet sales, police cars, and taxicabs. In 1982, the Grand Fury became the same thing as a Dodge Diplomat, or essentially the same car that had already been selling in Canada as the Caravelle. Wheelbase was down to 113, and length to 206, and weight about 3,500 pounds. The Slant 6 and the 318 carried on. Prices were still climbing, now $7,800 to start, while sales were still about $18,000. The car would see very little in changes as it carried on until 1989. Still relying on fleet sales, the police package used a 5.2 liter 318 with 175 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque, giving the car a low 17-second quarter mile. By the end, prices were near $12,000, and 1989 sales were under $5,000. This would be the last big Plymouth, and Plymouth itself had lost its purpose in Chrysler's lineup, so its days were already numbered. But as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.